Okay, we still have people coming in, but I'd like to go ahead and start the discussion series. Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Maria Lisa Christie. I'm at the Center for International Research, Education, and Development at Virginia Tech. Welcome to our Global Development Discussion Series. And thank you to Continuing in Professional Education for co-sponsorship this year. We're very happy you could all join us for today's discussion featuring Dr. Frida Mubici-Kut. So as of this morning, we had 51 people registered for today's event, but we've had a flood of more people registering since then. But at that time, we had a lot of folks from Virginia Tech. And then we also had other US universities, of course, Cornell, Mayerwood University, University of Minnesota. And then we had folks particularly from Ghana and Malawi, and Ecuador. So in Ghana, we had University of Cape Coast in Ghana, Liwanga University of Agriculture and Natural Resources in Malawi, and the Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. So welcome to everyone. If I did not mention your country or institution. So as you saw, those that saw the intro slides there, this event will be recorded. So it will be available to you on our website and on VTWorks later. And for everyone who's staying on, you're agreeing to being recorded. So if you don't want your image recorded, be sure that you turn your camera off. Okay, just a repeat of some of the brief housekeeping notes. This will last approximately 45 minutes. Our speaker's presentation will be 25 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A. And we'll have all the participants muted to enable the speaker to present without interruption. And of course, in order for the discussion to be as rich as it can be, we ask for everyone to be respectful and treat all participants with kindness and consideration. So you can post your questions anytime during the talk in the chat box, because we'll be saving them in a Google Doc and I'll be able to read from there. But if you would like, at the end of the talk, if you'd like to ask your question yourself, you can raise your hand virtually, and then we'll keep track of the order. So we'll ask you to speak so we don't have interruptions and we maintain netiquette. So if you'd like to enable captions at the bottom of your Zoom, find the option More, select it, and select Show Captions, and you will select English. Now, what you've been waiting for, to introduce our speaker. Dr. Frida Mubici-Kut is a professor of practice in applied economics and management and the executive director of the Student Multidisciplinary Applied Research Team's SMART program at the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business. She's trained first as an international business administrator and later as a social scientist. Frida has worked with various organizations, including former USAID supported Feed the Future Innovation Labs. Before joining Cornell University, she served as director of measurement and evaluation within a USDA agricultural commodity research program. Frida holds a PhD from the University of Missouri, an MA from Northeastern University, an MBA from Oklahoma City University, and an MS and BA from the United States International University, Africa. Her work is focused on understanding the role of social networks and development policies, the role that they play in the uptake of new agricultural technologies, gender equity, and economic progress. Today, she'll present empirical studies and engaged learning projects from sub-Saharan Africa to illustrate how existing social, economic, and technological environments influence women's entrepreneurship. So the title of her talk is From Margins to Markets, Women, Technology, and Entrepreneurial Development in Emerging Markets. Please welcome Dr. Frida Mubici-Kut.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share a little bit about my work with all of you. Just absolutely amazing to hear of all the voices and people who are presented here. So I hope that my work sheds not just a little glimpse of what I do, but more importantly, creates an opportunity for us to have more of a discussion and share a lot of our lived experiences, as I'm sure many of you are here today because of your interest in this particular field. So beyond the introduction that has been gracefully provided by Maria Elise, I am going to tell you my story in my own words because I feel as a social scientist and as a researcher and someone who actually teaches field research, it's always good for us to situate ourselves and be able to tell people where we come from and why we apply a certain lens to the things we do. So I start my story by sharing a little bit about my roots. And this is a picture of me and my mother years ago. My mother's been deceased for over 10 years, a little too many years to even want to count. But one thing my mother used to tell me was that if you educate a woman, you've educated a whole village. And it honestly never made sense to me. It never made sense to me because one, I was brought up in pretty much what I would call a missionary hospital. She was a nurse, and my biggest playmates, since my siblings were 4 and 5 years younger, were the kids who came to the hospital. And so many of them had malnutrition, they had kwashiorkor. Sometimes when I mention that to my students, they have no clue what this malnutrition disease is. And no one really understands how lack of protein itself really affects one's development. But I struggled with this saying that she kept on reminding me that, when you educate a woman, you educate a village. And maybe this is part of why I have really cared more and more over the years about the women, because I've witnessed them at my childhood where they would be held hostage for not being able to have their children's hospital bill paid off. So that became my first contradiction of what one of my students decided to call a TCK. I never knew that there was something as a third culture kid. This is what you call people who grew up in missionary households and also away from the original culture. The other thing that informs my place in the world is my personal struggle having grown up both in Kenya and in the US. I always found myself questioning, why is it that we have so many missionaries, so many volunteers always coming to Africa to try and fix things, to help? Why can't people do things for themselves in this wonderful country, this place? Yes, it may be dry, dusty, and all, but it just never made sense. And over the years, my faculty, my professors at grad school would tease me for being so torn on the questions I asked about, was colonialism really good or bad? Is capitalism good or bad? And so I call these a lot of the contradictions that drive my research and myself. So, as you all heard, I've had more schooling than I care to admit in public. But the one thing I would say that this schooling has finally lent me is a lens through which I look at my work. So, coming from Missouri, I am, of the diffusion of innovation um, theory, pretty much. So, that is the lens through which drives a lot of my work. So, before I decided to go back to grad school as an older person, I was running a nonprofit. And within that nonprofit, I worked with a lot of cooperatives, women entrepreneurs, women groups who were working on environmental conservation in Kenya. And I started noticing several trends that were so similar. Most of these women worked because they either were grandmothers who were taking care of grandkids, or they were actually just trying to supplement whatever little income they had. And as I started, questioning and trying to apply a lot of my MBA, I started realizing that not all that you are taught in school works. You cannot take your business plan from the MBA field and basically just place it into some of the community settings because the way the enterprises are built are not really formally as the same stuff that we had in class. And years later, working within several of the USAID innovation labs, as well as, working on projects with various governments, I've come to really start asking myself, if the business models that we try to apply, that we teach, don't really work, then how are we really going to go ahead and address this problem that I see, that I've seen from when I was a young child, of these hungry kids, these hungry mothers, hostage mothers, hungry fathers, and grandparents. So this, in many, many ways, does drive a lot of my work. But that said, coming from a college of business, I thought it would be good for us to just also anchor ourselves on some of the basic statistics that are out there. Looking at you know, the census, we love to say, well, show me the data, because the data never lies, right? But what was surprising as I was getting caught up with some of the statistics is just really realizing, when I look at the role women play within the formal business, which is usually, within the formal sector, the wage labor, we tend to hear that there are fewer women than men. But when you try to think about the gap, some of the statistics are really off. So, for example, if you look at North Africa, uh, there are very few women who are participating in any form of employment. But if you look at the case of, say, sub-Saharan Africa versus the rest of the world, what you start seeing is that women, in sub-Saharan Africa, are actually really doing well. There are about 64% women who are being reported to be within the formal employment sector versus 47 across the whole world. That is pretty impressive when you think about where the men are, because the men in sub-Saharan Africa about 77% compared to the rest of the world at 72%. Now, this data comes from about 2023, but when you think about the factors like COVID that have gone through, I don't think we're going to see much of a bigger difference. Um, some of the other things that we know to date, as we look at development, is that we know most of the enterprises that are really being led, that are employing these women, that we are also counting, tend to be informal. And where are they? So, for example, we have the informal craft that exports a lot of products through AGOA, which is, the free trade agreements with the US. And what you start seeing is those groups of women are being part of that informal, formal economy. But what we've seen is that women's employment is not just creating jobs that allow them to pay for goods and services, but it really does also play another really interesting piece that I finally see tying back to my mother's ask of, educating a woman to the village. When you think about how women spend their money, most of the times, and research continues to show over and over again, that women will tend to reinvest in education, in medical care, and other things that really contribute towards social development. At the same time, women will tend to create job and employment opportunities for other women. They're not just thinking about that on their own. And I saw this when I worked, when I ran my family nonprofit. And what I saw is that every time there was some school project, whenever I was renovating a classroom, it was the women who were always there. They were not thinking about what they would forgo that day. That said, one of the things that I wish I had learned in school, and this is something, when I think about myself as a researcher, some days I'm wondering, what is it that people really know, and what should I teach? And here are some of the things that I really wish I had learned earlier. Lesson one, I was sent out as a young social researcher on a project to Mozambique to really examine the adoption of a new bean variety. a black bean had been introduced, and over 13 billion had been poured into this particular bean. And what we started seeing as we were looking at adaptation is that we started seeing, yes, there was a lot of farming tasks that were being shared between men and women. But what was fascinating about this study, once we got all the data, was that we started seeing some interesting trends here. Women did a lot of the really hard labor, I would call it, the planting, the weeding, the threshing. But when it came to things like spraying and fertilizer application, they were not involved in that. And when we tried to find out why, they would say that it's for their health. You know, this is something that was culturally not permitted. But we also started seeing something else. When it came to going to the markets, it's the men who went. But what would happen? You know, they would go and the women would have to go back to caregiving. So I started questioning, why is it that the woman who works so hard doesn't get to have a say on how the income that is raised from this really goes back and gets used at the household? Lesson number two, I was working with the Soy Innovation Lab. Again, back Mozambique, Ghana, and we were working on trying to figure out what happens when you put out a new technology into the community. Who really adapts it? You know, what do men displace women farmers? Does it benefit? Does it grow economies? What happens? And so there were three hypotheses that I wanted to test with this study. The first one was, if people have access to extension services, as well as people who they can talk to, will that really help them in adapting a new agriculture technology? In this case, being a new seed variety, a new seed that would generate more income for their family, that would also create new innovative opportunities in terms of products. And the second one was trying to really understand the role social networks played in terms of development of new technologies as well as uptake. And finally, I also wanted to know if households that were led by women were more likely to uptake soybean, because one of the bigger goals for this particular innovation lab was to really look for ways through which protein could be introduced into the family household and also lead to some sales that would lead to income that went into other areas. What we found, and forgive me for putting a very busy network graph here, but I thought I would highlight this. What we found when we mapped out all the networks, there were very central points. So if you look at those stars, there's a very dark spot in the middle. Everybody seems to be going to one of those main nodes and getting the information from that. The bigger piece coming out of this was women, unlike men, actually suffered more when they had much tighter networks. The more family you had, the closer you were, the less likely you were going to adapt any of the new technology. And again, this became a new question of, is there a dark side to the network? Because we always say the more friends you have, the better off you are. In the case of Mozambique, that was not the case. So when we talk about the role of women in development and we look at their access to technology and markets, what are some of the things that we could see? Again, going back to the cases of Mozambique and looking at the climate resilient innovation lab that was working with the beans, we did a study again looking at the adoption of the new black bean variety. What was interesting in this was when we tried to look at women's access to the market, some of the things we started seeing was based on a score of 1 to, on a 5-point scale that was 0 to 4. What we started seeing is that men tended to have higher responsibilities compared to women. Uh, when we asked the men and the women if they had someone, if they had access to someone that they could ask or learn about market pricing, most men say that they knew somebody. Most women knew only one person or no one. The other thing we realized is that men tended to have more farmers that they could talk to and also the means to transport their beans compared to others. So that was something that we thought was pretty interesting. More recently, while working with my students, as Marie Elise mentioned, I do run an engaged learning program, and that program really does provide students the unique opportunity to get out to the real world, work with a community partner, and help them solve a problem. So E&E Green Farms is a woman-led business, founded out of COVID in the name and the hope of creating some employment as well as addressing food security. The co-founder wanted to see how they could use social media to really encourage more youth to engage in farming. So what we found was that, a lot of the youth were more inclined to use and adapt social media apps. On the contrary, the older farmers were more inclined to follow, offline strategies and listen to the radio. But while that could, inform the marketing strategy, what really struck me on this study is similar to the previous studies that had been over 10 years earlier in still the same southern region of Africa, is that we kept on seeing that men still occupied higher paying jobs compared to women. In a more recent study as well, and this is tied to the former ILSI, that is the Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement. So in Senegal, I had my graduate students work on their master's project on this. And what we were looking at within the value chain for cowpea and power millet was, if you introduce village-based agents, and women in particular played that role, would it really allow for improved access to seed as well as nutrition? And coming out of the field, some of the things we found was that as much as there's been a big push, some of the state-led campaigns and funded programs that are running through like the World Bank, we start seeing that as much as you can push that out, we have people unable to sell the seed because there's the free stuff being given by the government. So this is like a double-edged sword. So what do? Do you give free seed? How do you support that? The other thing we started seeing is that the cultural norms and the institutional norms, as much as Africa has really advanced, they still hold pretty deep within the rural areas. So you start seeing a lot of women, as much as they may own access to land, that usually does not afford them the wonderful opportunity to be able to make the decisions in terms of what they can plant, how much, and when they have a lot of the resources, they're presumed to not be worthy or equal. So that became another issue. Another Senegal case, and this is the last of the empirical studies that I would really want to highlight, comes from a much more recent study that was completed by another of my graduate students. And she did this project under the support of the Barrett Group over here at Cornell. And basically what the project had gone out to investigate was there is a lot of waterborne disease that is caused by little snail that lives within some of the vegetation within rivers. Because a lot of the women are fetching water for cooking, cleaning, and doing a lot of also getting the reeds that they use to make the mats. They tend to have one of the highest levels of infections of what I call bilharzia. Um, so the goal for this particular project was, following some modeling that had been previously done, could we create a green type of job? Could we create an employment opportunity that would allow women to take leadership of some industry that could turn this cerrado, this terrible invasive weed that grows within the rivers, can they turn that into compost that could be used within the garden? So natural fertilizer, or could they turn it into a cow feed? So it's high in nitrogen, so that's why it becomes a natural piece for fertilizer. But again, it's also pretty nutritious, which makes it a good animal feed. And so we started looking at that. And of course, there was a lot of literature that had looked at, mechanization adoption in sub-Saharan Africa. What are some of the things that have made it to succeed and fail? And going into the field, we found several things. Women in Senegal, as much as Senegal tends to be much better advanced compared to other West African countries, are still reporting some of the lowest levels of education. The other thing we saw is that, households that had access to some form of higher level of mechanized tools like sprayers and seeders were more likely to earn a little bit more money than others. What was most surprising for this was a lot of the equipment that had been introduced before. For example, for cutting down the reeds that used to make the mats that the women groups sell, they were not appropriate for the environment. The women complained that this great equipment came in, but when it cut the tifa, as they call it would be all on the water, which would make it soggy and useless for their weaving. So that raises the question of the kind of technology that gets out there. The other thing that we saw after doing some modeling is, it takes a lot of money to scale, a new business. And when you think about the larger agrochemical companies that are producing the chemical fertilizers, and many of them are multinationals, then these small community enterprises really get challenged in order they cannot sustain themselves. Finally, and this is what I call the beautiful highlight of all this, is that we started seeing women who had access to mobile money were able to actually do so much more. They could access training, they could actually access markets, and they were able to have stronger networks. So, what does all this mean? When I look at this as someone who really explores and enjoys looking at how policies could be changed to promote inclusive growth for all, I see several things. Changing policy trends due to institutional, we've seen a lot of institutional support that has led to higher and more inclusive education, uh, inclusive property rights. More women are able to earn incomes as well as also own property now. Tax incentives that really encourage companies to hire women. These are all part of why we're seeing these positive trends. The other thing that we're also seeing is that globalization, as much as, there are people who think globalization is the worst thing. This is where again, another contradiction. I am in a school of business. Should we shun globalization and capitalism, or should we embrace it as a pathway to development and think of ways that we could help shape some of the development policies that exist there? But I feel that globalization has not only opened new pathways through which entrepreneurial opportunities can be developed, but also created new ways through which information is can be accessed, which makes people much more productive. As we think about the role generative AI will play in the years coming, and especially right now, I'm personally very curious and will be looking forward to see how the young people, how women in sub-Saharan Africa will adapt Gen AI to contribute towards their entrepreneurial development. And that goes into, the changing infrastructure we're seeing within the technology space, the digital platforms and all. So in a nutshell, I would say I see a lot of hope and positive opportunities for the generations coming up. And I just cannot imagine, a world whereby women will not have the same opportunities as, everyone else. So with that, I will stop here so that we have a wonderful opportunity to have some discussion.
Thank you
Over
so
to you.
thank you so much. So um, I don't see any questions in the chat in the text, and I don't see a hand up. So I'm going to ask a first question to get people started, and hopefully, um, let's see. So you've mentioned that women, even in their smaller informal businesses, also create jobs and can be very innovative. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Okay, you all have to forgive me. I was brought up and I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. So I tend to adopt a very African stance by using storytelling rather than giving a lecture. So when I talk about women being innovative and creating job opportunities for others, what I've seen when I worked within the nonprofit sector in Kenya in particular, I worked with a group of women who were working to do some reforestation. And so they were planting some seedlings. And what they would do would be they would go out and get their friend and tell them, this is a new group that we've got that will also help us to create money. So can you pick whatever seedlings you have on your farm and join us? Better yet, when my grandmother lived in a very rural area, and one of the things she would always tell my mother about was how she worried for the kids in her village that they would never have a good education. They worried that the kids had to go fetch water from the rivers, and they spent so much time doing that. So, what she and a group of other women decided to do was to build a boarding school. Now, my grandmother was not educated, but she knew the value of education, having had my mother as a nurse and the others. So what ended up coming out of this is that they built a school, but this school created a means through which her women groups were able to generate income. They turned around and hired some of those other women to go in and work as the matrons, as the caregivers, as the cooks, and then they also created jobs for the young guys to come and build the school, and so on and so forth. So when I look at how women have really, how they create job opportunities for each other, I think that gives a good example of how I've seen this, over my years.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have two questions. Larry Vaughn raised his hand, so please go ahead and unmute yourself, Larry. And then we have a question from Leanna Blevins.
Okay, thank you, Frida. I was really interested in the example you gave in Mozambique, where the tight networks were more resistant to adoption than the looser networks. It seems like there would be great value if you could predict before you get very far into a technology transfer program which kind of networks you have and how they might behave. So that was the first part of the question. Then the second part is, when you're further along down the adoption timeline, might those tighter resistant networks actually catch up or even surpass the looser networks? Once you've overcome that threshold to adoption, if adoption might spread fast within those networks. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I will go ahead and answer your questions in the same order you asked them. So what we saw is the friendship networks tended to be among the men were actually quite interesting. The friendship networks allowed for men to be able to go out into the marketplaces and gain more information. For the women, it was a little different in that what we suspect was happening, and this is something that we keep on saying we do need to do a little bit more investigation on, is we saw women who were very close, their family, their kin, their friends network versus the business networks. They did not want to break with the norm. They did not want to go outside what was acceptable. It had to be something that was permitted by someone higher up, someone of authority. So there was that whole piece of I do not want to stray. The places where we saw that being a little different is when we had women who had slightly higher levels of education, then they were willing to take a risk, which goes into your second question. You know, when you break away from the tight network and you're on a much looser connection, are you able to take on new technology? And the answer is yes. And I think a lot of that comes out of that risk taking, that you really don't owe anyone an apology, that you're willing to take a risk to really grow because you're not being constrained by that. So I hope that really does help answer the question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay, go. Let's see. Am I unmuted? Yes, Liana, please unmute yourself.
First, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. Thank you for being here. Very interesting and good work. I'm wondering if you have tried to replicate some of the things you've done in rural parts of the United States. And if so, I'm interested in where, because rural is very different in the US, in parts of the US as it is compared to the other parts of the world. So I'm interested in hearing if you have done that or if you know of others who have tried to do something similar in rural United States.
Thank you, Leanna, for that question. So after I left University of Missouri, I worked for the soybean board. And one of the things I did working with soybean farmers was to, I was building an evaluation system that would allow the board, being the checkoff, to understand how new technology, in terms of new seed varieties that they were paying universities to research and develop, CRISPR, for example, how it was being adapted. And the other piece we were looking at, and this came up after, actually during COVID and after COVID, was access to internet. And so I went back and tried to replicate some of the social network studies we had done with folks from University of Tennessee. Unfortunately, I left before we had completed those studies. And also we had to stop, some of those for other reasons. But what we saw is some of the behaviors we saw on the networks in terms of how close-knit people remained would also restrict what they were willing to adapt and not adapt, is the same pattern that we saw. Farmers in a particular area, if they farmed conventional soybeans, then they would tend to keep to that. And part of their reasoning was if someone was trying to introduce a non-GM, a non-GMO variety that did not require some of the sprayers, then they were worried that, if someone sprays their field, it will contaminate their variety and hence they lose the market. So you start seeing some of those, it's your neighbor, you want to be the same because you can hedge when you're bigger. That collectiveness is something that we see across. Where you saw bigger splits is when someone's got a little bit more land, more money, So they're willing to try new practices like conservation agriculture. They're willing to try other things that really went beyond what a smaller farmer would go. So I would love and welcome the opportunity to try replicate some of those. But yes, thank you for that, Leona.
Gabriel. And then after that is Deborah Rubin. And then we've got several more coming up.
Hello. Are there any plans or like avenues that already exist to teach more about building networks and educating that, like, because it seemed when you discussed like how tighter knit family networks, it feels like knowing more about how the different types of networks affect innovation can be pretty valuable information. And are there any like plans to kind of spread that information?
So that's a great question, Daniel. The question of how, different types of networks will affect spread of information is something I would say social scientists are really always thrilled to engage in. And, as someone who came from a pure business to sociology background, I would say I would look at it with a caution in the sense that one of the biggest criticisms I have on international development has been we tend to study one thing and think that's the norm across all of the networks. So, for example, let me clarify this. When we looked at the behaviors of women, who had higher levels of education, who were loosely connected, and so they had weak ties with everyone else. So they were more willing to go to market. They were more willing to try new seed. Uh, we could not really pinpoint whether it was just the education that led to that kind of a behavior. We could not pinpoint if it's because they were the sole breadwinner for the family, that's why they had to really take those higher risks. So one thing we know is that human beings are very, very complex. So while you can really look at how different traits and different, environments could shape the way networks work, I think what's most important is for you to ask, what is the role of that particular network? Do you want it to reinforce something, or do you want it to change that? Because what we know and what we see is that networks are also built within some existing social institution. Those social institutions being the way our families are built, the religious groups that we're in, as well as the types of schools we go to. So I'm sorry I'm not doing a good job in answering that completely, Daniel, but I hope that just allows you to see how tough it is to just say, this is what we need to fix to just be able to address this adoption.
I think you won't be able to fully answer any of these questions. They're great questions, great presentation. We have 3 more questions right now. So Deborah Rubin, would you please unmute yourself and go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Frida, for such an interesting presentation and managing to do so much in such a short time. I wanted to follow a little bit on Larry Vaughn's question and to ask you to expand about how women might be able to better formalize their small businesses, given that they face so many constraints, and whether there are ways in which AI might actually help them in that process.
That's a loaded one. That's a loaded one. And I would say I think that needs to be like my next big smart project because I've got a couple of projects this year in sub-Saharan Africa, in Kenya, that are actually looking at how AI can be built into that. Women entrepreneurs, particularly within the digital platforms, because what I've seen is we have a lot of young women who have signed up to be digital content creators. So they're doing this and pushing out a lot of promotions. And as I've been watching this trend go on, there are a couple of things that have really struck me. One is there is a very high educated population of young Africans, and because of that and the lack of jobs, technologies such as Gen AI offer a new pathway through which they can create tools and services as well as products that they can sell. So that becomes one way. How they are able to support that and how they could formalize that, because right now they're basically working for someone else. Perhaps, and I say perhaps with a caution, grain of salt, one pathway could be using the collective organizing strategy that we've seen with cooperatives. Um, what I've realized based on my work is when you have a collective of people, uh, the, that creates a lot of noise that tends to get visibility from the local governments. In the case of Rwanda, when we worked with E&E firms and we were looking at how they were able to multiply the seed that they were exporting to other countries, what we learned is that they were encouraging women to work in groups, and those groups would end up being registered. The local government would encourage them to register because when they were registered as a collective, then they would have access to micro grants, loans, training, which in turn gave them more formality than anything else and gave them more opportunity. So in a nutshell, in summary, I think looking at successful models such as the cooperatives that have worked, that could be one approach that they could use to formalize themselves because that's recognized by the government. But at the same time, it will give them a way to mitigate and de-risk what we see being one of the reasons why most of them remain informal. No one wants to give, an informal organization a loan or credit because there is no mechanism through which they can get that collateral. So I hope that helps offer some insights on that.
Well, thank you. I think that that's great because it also speaks to what has been found in many of the women's empowerment in agriculture index studies that not belonging to a group is one of the largest factors in disempowerment. So appreciate you confirming that with your own research.
Yes. Maria Lisa,
Yes,
you're
Abia, Tam, George, they've unmuted themselves. Go ahead with your question, and then I'll read another question after that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Frieda, for your insightful presentation. So I was particularly interested in your point about how free government programs like seed distribution can sometimes have unintended consequences for small local enterprises. So how do you think policymakers can strike a balance between offering essential support to vulnerable farmers and ensuring that these interventions don't weaken women-led businesses in the agricultural value chain?
That is a really good question. And it's good because it's one of my Achilles heels coming out of Rwanda, if I may be honest with all of you. And it's also my Achilles heel because I'm working with a postdoc in Malawi who's looking at the seed value chains. And one of the biggest questions has been how can governments better balance these policies that are sometimes actually encouraged by outside organizations, multilateral organizations that are trying to build some, some development efforts. And I would say one of those has, I believe, having participatory engagement with all the community stakeholders within that, would be one way that they could balance that because there will never be a one size fits all. And I think what we've seen, not just in within sub-Saharan Africa, but even here at the US, when I worked at the soybean board, which is part of USDA, is that often policymakers come up with these brilliant ideas and they don't really recognize the implications on the ground. So being able to bring the different stakeholders to the table and have a clearly thought through strategy on how do they roll out, or how could they limit, or how do they face, how do they face some projects, that could be one pathway that would really help balancing, but not to say we're going to turn on the tap today for subsidies and tomorrow we're going to turn it off. So I think having some measured and tempered approach that really engages everybody would be one pathway that you could really mitigate some of these concerns we see.
Okay, I'm going to read one of the questions, but also from Aiden Cabrera, but I want to remind you of the question that they're referring to. So their question is, building off Liana Blevins, what aspects of these interactions do you think apply in a more worldwide view, in both other separated worlds and in denser communities? So Liana had asked if you've replicated your international work in any rural US communities, or are you aware of others who have done similar work? It's like a dense question. So, and I think we'll have time for one more question if somebody wants to just raise their hand in the box or write something in the chat. Okay, thank you.
So, Adriana, I'm a little torn on how to answer your question, because the question of replicating a study, we could look at it in terms of, the methods, the methodology that gets adapted. That could be one way to answer it. But again, when you think about interactions, there is a question of culture, the cultural differences. So maybe do we think about that in terms of, what are some cultural values or norms that drive certain behaviors, attitudes, perceptions? It's a pretty tough one without having a little bit more specific things.
So I put in, so I know that was a dense and like overlapping question. Yeah. So Aiden asked, building on that, are there, do you think some of these interactions apply? Let's see. Aiden was asking, yeah, do some of these apply in a more worldwide view in both separated worlds and in denser communities? I don't know if you understand that question. Otherwise, we have 5 minutes to go, so I would ask if anybody else would like to raise their hand or put a question in the chat. Otherwise, we got a new one. Okay, otherwise I'll ask a question, but, oh, you're shy. Now, let me ask a question about wondering if the tariffs that the US is putting in place is affecting men and women differently.
Oh boy, that's a fun one, because I don't think there's anyone who's not suffered from the tariffs, to be honest. Driving into school this morning, there was a whole discussion with the American Soybean Association president, and they were asking him about whether the soybean farmers, feel the proposed 100 billion bailout is going to be the solution. But what I would say in terms of this question is, I feel everybody will be affected, and particularly women more disproportionately in Africa, because a lot of what the sectors that Africa has been supporting, or rather a lot of the sectors that employ women in Africa, are the same ones that are shipping agriculture products, crops, to the US. At the same time, places like Lesotho, Kenya, they have built all these export processing zones that have been behind development of the apparel sector. A lot of the jeans and clothes we buy from our department stores are made in Africa. And I don't know if people even realize that. And knowing that about 6 out of 10 of the people in those factories are women, I absolutely see women being disproportionately impacted by this. And, it's not just them. It's going to have a cascading effect, because when these women are affected, then their children don't get to go to school. Then we've got another generation of poverty being created. So it's a bigger problem than we see.
Okay, well, I'm so sorry to end this discussion on such a sad note, but I am going to have to wrap it up. It's 2:22, so I want to thank you so much to everybody for attending, and of course, Frida, for this wonderful presentation. We're sharing a link in the chat for a survey that we'd really appreciate if you send some feedback in there. It helps us bring future wonderful speakers like Frida. And I do want to announce our next event is November 13th. Also on Zoom, Dr. Deepti Chatti, an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning and the Critical Gender Studies program. She will be talking about gender empowerment and how it is experienced subjectively and the nature of its relationship to, quote, development. So don't miss this one. Hope to see you on November 13th.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.